Welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville, and today I want to touch on a topic which I raised in a video I did a couple of weeks ago, where I was talking about, I was doing a state of the channel quarterly review type thing, and I mentioned that about a year and a half ago I stopped being a watch accumulator and started considering myself a watch collector, and I kind of skipped over what that meant. But today I would like to kind of touch on, what do I think is a watch collector? What are the rules of watch collecting? And I might very quickly touch on kind of my rules and what do I apply to myself. So I'll start by talking about what separates someone who accumulates watches, or just someone who's got a lot of watches, from someone that we would call a watch collector. And it's pretty straightforward, but we'll step through it in little bits. The first bit is, what is the act of collecting? And what I would say there is, collecting is not simply amassing things, creating a huge hoard so that, like the dragon smorg, you can sort of sit on it and keep the dwarves away. No, I think the act of collecting is more like a game. And my favourite definition of a game is things that you do for pleasure, where you take an otherwise simple task and make it difficult by imposing arbitrary rules. So that, to me, is what separates, for example, the idea of just going for a swim and being in a swimming race or playing water polo. Suddenly it's no longer just get from here to there, it's get from here to there doing this, holding this, with a ball that goes through here. So it's taking that otherwise simple and easy thing and making it hard, but also really interesting by imposing rules. That's what creates a game. And I think collecting anything, whether it's cars, stamps, rocks, begins with the idea of saying, this is something I'm going to do for pleasure, and it's something that's going to have rules. It's those rules that separate the watch collector from simply the guy with a lot of watches. The guy with a lot of watches will just buy what he likes, but at the end of the day he sits down and asks, why do I have these? What do they mean to me? Can't answer those questions. Whereas the person who's come up with some rules, knows what would satisfy them broadly, and then buys things in accordance with that rule, is collecting, as opposed to simply accumulating watches. Now, I think that there are essentially two meta rules. There's two rules that govern all collecting that we have to follow if we are going to be a collector. The first rule is that, one, there must be rules that describe, there must be at least a rule that describes how you are going to make your collection. How are you going to choose? How are you going to curate the things that you buy and put into your collection? That's the first rule, that there must be a rule. The second rule is, only you can write your rules. There is no handbook of the horological collecting rules that everyone must follow, other than those first two of have a rule and make your own rules. If you want to collect Rolexes, all power to you. If you decide that your rule is you want to have one of every XKX, go for it. There is nothing wrong with that. If you decide that you want to try and collect an example of every watch ever designed by Gerald Genta, A, well done, and two, yeah, great rule. Every one of those is a legitimate rule. It doesn't matter what you want to do. What matters is that you think about what you want to do. Now, I can't tell you or anyone else, I'm barely figuring out what my rules are now. I've been doing this I've been like collecting for about a year and a half, and my rules are still changing. So I am the last person who feels confident telling people what your rules should be. I can't even begin to say. As I said, mine are still a bit fluffy. But here are some tips that I would pass on to other people. The first is, realize that your rules will change. That as you get more into this hobby, your circumstances will change. You will move from being able to afford one style of watch to being able to afford another style of watch. You will move from understanding and appreciating the aesthetics of watches in one way, and then as you get more into this, you're going to learn that there's new ways of looking at watches, that there's new things to care about. And that does not mean that you are necessarily going to buy more and more expensive watches as you get used to this and suddenly start hankering after Royal Oaks. Watching a few other people, it's interesting to talk, who have been doing this for like decades. It's interesting to watch how they talk about their trajectory as they started at the bottom, they shot to the top buying APs and Pateks and have sold all of that, and they're now, collecting Omegas or G-Shocks or something like that. They had to go through that full cycle to realize where their passion really was. So I suppose the tip I would give you is don't overcommit, not in the early stages. Don't imagine you're going to nail exactly what it is that you want to collect with your first watch, or even in the first year or two of even buying watches. What I might also think about is, if you're buying that first watch, A, don't overcommit, don't invest too much in it. But B, remember 20 years from now, or even a year from now, if you start a YouTube channel, at some point you're going to be saying the words, and my first watch was. So think in terms of, what would you like your first thing to be? And I'd suggest, as well as not overcommitting, you might want to buy something which is fairly iconic or memorable to you. I'm going to wrap this up pretty quickly, but before I go, the last thing I'll do is, I'd sort of said I'll talk about my rules. By the way, I say rules, they're more guidelines than rules, let's be honest. If you see something, maybe that's a third rule, that if you see something you really like, you really, really want, you are by definition allowed to ignore any other rule that you've created. But we'll talk about that later. Very broadly, my rules for collecting, the rules I put on myself. And you get some of these if you look at my, what are the deal makers and deal breaker videos, which I'll put in the notes here. I'll put links in the notes here. But very broadly, I tend to collect mechanical watches that cost between $500 and $2,000 US. I tend to aim at very tooly watches. I have a special focus on a couple of brands. So I have a special focus on Alpina. I have a special focus on kind of German and Germanic styled brands. So I like brands that are a little bit off the beaten track, that you won't necessarily have seen a lot of. So I'm sort of getting ready to pull the trigger on a Jean Ricard. I really like, as I said, the German brands like Mule Glasuta, that sort of thing. And I suppose the other sort of cornerstone of what I collect right now that I'm focusing on are GMT watches. So tooly kind of GMT watches from all sorts of brands tend to be off the beaten track, with a special focus on Alpinas is kind of a chunk of my collection. And I also specifically go looking for vintage Alpinas. So I have another sort of sideline going in vintage Alpina watches. And so that's kind of what I look for. And that's they're not rules, they're more guidelines of my collection. Interestingly though, I can feel my rules changing. I can feel where I want to go, sort of changing direction. That doesn't mean I don't want to collect the things I was just talking about. In fact, as I said, I'm looking at one or two watches right now and saving to pull the trigger on a genre, possibly a Jean Ricard, possibly a Mule Glasuta fairly soon. But I'm getting attracted to JLCs, and I'm thinking I'm going to join the unpronounceable Jaja La Culture faction, probably if not late this year, early next year. I've kind of even got my references picked out, but I'm not going to commit to that just yet. But yeah, I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that by this time next year I will definitely have my first JLC on my wrist. Yeah, so that's really my take on collecting. I don't think that there's an arbitrary bar that we must all follow, other than some very general rules about having rules that we impose upon ourselves. I think collecting can... I just did a whole video on the watch as a positional good and how we can get sucked into competition. I actually think that's one of the real benefits of labeling yourself as a collector and thinking hard about what your rules are. In fact, that's kind of this topic is linked to that previous one. I think this idea of what are your rules, how do you want to define what being a watch collector is actually a really good way of coping with that mechanism of the competition, the consumerism, the social positioning that can come out of watches, and how we can feel a bit kind of intimidated around people with much more, let's be frank, much more expensive collections than we can afford. This is another one of those areas where there can be a kind of a win-win. By defining yourself as a collector and then defining what your collection is, you can help kind of identify and then isolate yourself from external pressures to buy the next thing. It's kind of reinforcing what do they call it, virtuous circle, where by thinking hard about being a collector, far from sucking you into the elitist side of the sport of watch collecting, you can actually create yourself your own little walled and safe garden where you can play by your rules, enjoy someone else playing their game, but you can also enjoy your own and not feel like you have to compete with anyone else because you're playing your own game to your own rules. Anyway, I fear I'm rambling a little bit now, and I don't know how the edit of this video is going to work out. I've actually not scripted this at all. This has been very close to a stream of consciousness, so I fear I might have saved myself 10 minutes of just writing some notes by imposing 3 hours of trying to cut together something that makes sense out of this video. We'll see how that goes. Anyway, I'm done. This has been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. Please subscribe.